Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week for a deeper look into the previous week's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest. And as always, joined with me is our senior pastor, Michael Estes.
We're back in the studio today.
Back in the studio. We have fended off the winter storm.
And it's now 60 degrees outside.
Yeah, now it's spring.
It feels wonderful.
This
is welcome to Mississippi. For those who are not from here and listen to us, this is normal for us this time of year. It'll be 12 degrees one week and 65 degrees and sunny the next.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Really the next day.
Yeah.
Maybe even the same day.
Right. Yeah, so. It was weird, and it was exciting. You know, kids got to have a full week.
It was exciting for a day or two.
Yeah.
And then it was not exciting anymore.
And see, I love it. You know, of course, again, I'm from East Tennessee, right. And we of course, where we were, we didn't get a whole lot of snow, but we'd at least get a couple of good snows a year, you know, usually. And so I love it. You know, I'm one of those people who I could live in Alaska, where snow's on the ground the entire winter, and you're just driving over it, just having a good time, and I just love the way it looks, and I love just driving over a hard packed snow. And you know, that's something in East Tennessee we don't get because they've got salt trucks and road scrapers and stuff, so they clear off the roads, and so we'll have snow in the grass for a few days or whatever before it warms up. But the roads are basically clear the whole time. You know, here, you know, Mississippi doesn't have any of that equipment because there's not really any need for it.
Because most of the time, one day it snows and the next day it's warm.
Right. You know, and so this was it was great. You know, I've got out every day and just to go out and just drive around and get out of the house. Part of that is because I can't stand to be cooped up in the house. Yeah. But, you know, part two of that was just I just love the way it looks, just driving on hard packed snow, you know, across the road. But I know I'm in the minority.
You most certainly are. I remember saying out loud to several of two of my children at least that this has convinced me that I never want to live in the Northeast or in the Midwest because I don't want to deal with this on a regular basis because well, now they're more equipped for it.
Sure.
But
yeah. Weather-wise, I could live in one of those places very easily.
I don't mind cold. It's just I want to be able to leave.
Yeah.
And do things, and I just that I couldn't handle the. It's not safe to drive. We need to stay at home kind of thing.
Yeah. There's an airport up in I believe it's in New Hampshire. But it's really only open about 3 months out of the year, January, February, March, because it's a river and it freezes over, and so they plow the snow, and you have they basically make a runway there in New Hampshire you can fly into, but you can only fly into it three months out of the year because it's so cold, and but it'd be pretty neat, and they plow it up, and I think it's about a 2,000 foot runway, or no, I think they do about 3,000 or 4,000 feet runway, and then the river is much longer, so you can keep going. Just the problem is you run out of what's been plowed, and I'd imagine the
slow down a lot quicker after that.
but yeah, so I could definitely get behind something like that. Yeah, but I like the winter. I like the cold if it snows.
Right.
I don't like just to be cold.
To be cold.
Yeah, but I like snow on the ground.
So you don't like Mississippi's weather at all, really?
No, not much.
Understand.
Yeah,
if you're not from here, I can understand that.
It's not great because really in the winter we get cold. We have our own rainy season here, so you get a kind of cold, rainy season, and then the summer you get hot,
really hot,
and then you don't really have a spring or fall, and those are really my favorites.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So, oh well. Now that we have done our meteorological survey,
this is our this is the meteorology segment of our podcast.
Let's jump into the good stuff, which is the Lord's Prayer.
So much better than talking about the weather.
Absolutely. So this week, kind of continuing this series on prayer of, looking at, Jesus kind of teaching us to pray. We see this model prayer, and kind of all your points this week was looking at some specific things that the model prayer teaches us, through that. And so we're going to dive into some of that a little bit. But to get started, I have one question to ask, because you mentioned it kind of in passing, I guess. I was in the first service, so I'm not exactly sure if it was any different in the second service, but you mentioned, growing up as a kid and being involved in a church where you memorize the Lord's Prayer. Again, typically when we quote the Lord's Prayer, we're quoting the one from Matthew because that's just the one we know most often is most likely used to memorize and things of that sort. So we memorize this, and me as a kid, I can remember at times reciting that prayer and doing that. And so you mentioned doing that, and you mentioned the value in knowing that prayer and having some sort of not reciting, probably not the right term, but maybe praying that prayer and things like that. And so the question is the Lord's Prayer something that we should really memorize and recite, maybe as a corporate prayer or just as a reminder, or kind of how do you view that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And by the way, the reason that we have another reason that we have a tendency to use Matthew's version is that the formal word for it's more liturgical, and it flows more easily than Luke's version. And I struggled with reading Luke's version occasionally out loud like that. I think that probably when I preached the passage last week, the week previous to this one, and I did that one verse from Luke, but I went ahead and read the Lord's Prayer with that. I struggled to read it out loud, even though I'd read it a bunch of times privately, because I was so used to that more flowing, longer form in Matthew.
Yeah.
And so, and I mentioned this just a little bit in passing in the first service. I didn't mention it in the second service, but the fact that we have two versions of this and how a lot of scholars think that Luke's version came first. It was the shorter and what they would call more primitive version, and then Matthew's version is an extended version of it in a place where Jesus was speaking specifically on prayer to a fairly large group of people. Yeah. This was directed directly to the disciples, and so, anyways. So back to your question, should we memorize and recite this? If we look at that as an end to itself, then I think we're wasting our time memorizing and reciting it. But I have a question for you.
Okay.
Is it important that you memorize your anniversary date?
Depends on who you ask. Yes, it is important.
How come?
Because, a few reasons. One, because it's special, and you remember that. But then also it shows that the other person that you remember that, and you hold value on that as well.
Right. So it's a way of making sure you're communicating to the other person that you care about them.
Yeah.
I think very similarly, when we memorize the Lord's Prayer and we use it as a kind of a launching point for our prayers, what it does, if we understand that it is a link to a person and not an end unto itself, where we're like, hey, I'm doing this and now I feel good about the fact that I memorized this and I've said this prayer. I feel good about this. No, it is intended to be a link to a person. The same way, just because I remember my anniversary date doesn't show Julie that I value her, but the fact that I remember on that day that this is a special day and we do something to celebrate that shows that I value her. And so I can memorize this and recite it all day long and never really connect to the person that I'm actually praying to. But I do think there is value in doing that, as long as it's communicated. We do this in relationship with our Father.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not a huge fan of one of the things that I've shared on here before, and we've talked about this before. I coach my youngest son's baseball team, and we try to pray before every game as a reminder of the fact that this is a gift from God, and it's fun, and we're supposed to enjoy this. It's supposed to teach us how to be better people, those sorts of things. We don't pray the Lord's Prayer before a lot of games. I know a lot of people who do. Yeah. Jackson's been on teams where that's done before, but there's never really any connection made there. It's just something that's attached to the game.
Yeah.
And so that can be good, that can be bad. I think in most cases where we just attach it to things, that's bad. Eugene Peterson, the guy who translated the Message version of the Bible, he has this. He talks about prayer in a book that I'm reading, where he talks about this idea that we should never see prayer as something that we just attach to events.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about this in one of your questions in just a minute, but it should be something where we're communicating with a person. David Platt puts it this way. He said something along the lines of, when we understand that prayer is not so that we can get something, but so that we can be with someone, that is when we are making a huge breakthrough in prayer.
Yeah.
We don't just simply go to God to get something from Him. We go to God to be with Him.
Yeah.
And obviously we offer up these concerns and requests, but the fact that we're with Him is really the point. Same way when we memorize and recite this,
Sure.
if it links us to our Father, then that's the point. If it's just something that we do so we can check off a list, then obviously it's not good.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to kind of that motivation of heart, you know, and so that I think that's good, and it's very easy for us to attach religious or liturgical aspects of faith to, you know, culture and things of that sort.
Yeah.
Because it kind of makes us feel good, like, oh, well, I'm doing this little
Just
tidbit,
sanctifies
you know,
it.
Yeah, this is sanctifying this event, and you know, and so I can see where that temptation would be there, because you kind of say, well, all of a sudden now this event is holy, when the motivation may not actually be there. So that's good. All right, so, you know, continuing looking at, you know, and actually kind of jumping into looking at the prayer itself, your first point kind of looked at placing precedence on the person of God, and specifically you talked about how name, you know, really equaled character, you know, in that culture, and you know, so I think that's really good. And here in the specific prayer, Jesus refers to God as Father, and so you talked about this, you know, throughout the sermon a little bit, you know, but what is the significance of approaching God as Father instead of just kind of like this distant deity that we're worshiping?
Yeah, you see a really good example of how the approach changes in Esther. So we looked at Esther last year, before, I think it was last year, before quarantine and everything like that. We went through the book of Esther as a church, and one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that when Esther marries the king, is forced to marry the king, but she's put in this position to where she can save her people. But when she goes to the king, she has to approach him not as a husband, but as a king in authority. And like, if she goes before him and he's not in a good mood that day, he could have her killed, or banished.
Yeah.
And like, I think sometimes when we approach God, we kind of approach Him in that way, as this distant, authoritarian, potentate, you know, type king thing.
Right.
And we're like, I hope he's in a good mood today. I'm going to come to him and very cautiously present my request to him. But you think about how a child approaches their father. You know, like, I think about like when my children were really young and they fell down and they scraped their knee. Their first move is hands up, arms up, please hold me, right? It's not bow down and like hope that the father doesn't smite the child. You know, it is this really intimate thing. And I think that when we approach God in prayer, we are invited into this really intimate relationship, and not this, man, I hope God's in a good mood today. I think so much of our theology is tied up in that, because like, I think so often we get into these places where our theology is kind of like this Job theology. I'm reading Job right now, and you see this really clearly. There's these competing theologies that are in Job, where Job's like, hey, I know who I am, and I know who God is. This is terrible. These things are bad. I don't love my life right now. I wish God would help me or relieve me in this situation, those sort of things. And Job's friends are like, dude, the reason that this happened to you is because you're wicked. You did something wrong.
Right.
It's your fault. And, of course, we know from the very beginning of the book that that's not the case.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we have the theology of Job's friends where, like, okay, I did sin today. I sinned a bunch today. God's going to be angry with me. I can't go to him. We don't see him as a father. We see him as this almost Zeus-like character who's capricious, and like, if it's a bad day, then he's going to strike us down. If it's a good day, then maybe he'll graciously grant our requests. And but there's no inclination of this intimate, deep, fatherly sort of relationship. And some of that, by the way, is and to be real, is affected by our relationship with our earthly fathers. Right?
Yeah.
If we have the experience of an earthly father who is capricious, whose mood changes from moment to moment, and we don't really know what we're going to get when we approach that father, that probably will affect our understanding of God as Father. We don't need to discount that at all. But the picture that we have in Scripture is that God is the Father that all other fathers ought to aspire to be.
Yeah.
And we see that really clearly in the prodigal son, right?
Yeah.
The parable of the prodigal son. God is the Father who, when the son walks away and is like, I wish you were dead, waits every single day for him to return.
Yeah.
And when he sees him return, he doesn't just sit on the porch with his arms crossed and, I'm waiting for you to ask for forgiveness now. He runs to him and he just embraces him and desires to forgive. And that should be the type of understanding that we have when we approach God in prayer.
Yeah, that's good. And, when I was a kid, growing up in a church I was involved in, and I guess I was in older elementary school or middle school, and there was an individual in our church who, when he would pray, he was a deacon, and so he would pray either before offering or other times, just whenever he would pray. But he always opened his prayers with, "Dear Heavenly Daddy," and this is an individual. He was kind of a large guy, kind of had kind of a burly look, to him, and but he was very soft spoken, very tender, and that's how he approached the Father. Was he was grew up country, and so you called your dad Daddy, in very country setting, and so that's how he would have approached the Father, and approached God, and that's always kind of stuck with me as a unique thing, because again he wasn't trying to formalize prayer. He was literally just trying to view God and approach God in that context,
as he's presented
to us in Scripture. So that's always kind of been an encouragement to me as far as how to approach God in prayer.
Yeah, that's good. That reminds me a lot of the research I did on the word Abba, because I was just curious. Like, I want to be careful. I don't want to approach God in an irreverent way.
Sure.
I know He's holy. I know He's great. But the fact that Jesus refers to Him as Abba and tells us to,
right,
tells me that, okay, we have been invited into this really intimate, and the word that stuck with me is when it was talking about Abba in the research that I was doing, is the fact that it was an everyday homely word.
Yeah.
Like, this is what you would use in the home when you're just walking around, living life every single day, interacting as a family. This is what a child would call his father, his dad.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, anyways, there can be some discomfort in there because you do want to approach God reverently.
Right, and I think that's where the challenge comes into play, is because, which is why I kind of asked this question, because it's hard, because, like you said, you want to be able to make sure through our prayer, we are coming to Him in a place of submission and recognizing that He is holy, and that we are really, we don't deserve to be able to approach Him in that way, and and so you have that kind of that you're wrestling with, and I think which can lead us to that very almost very religious practice of praying of I need to approach Him and say these specific words, kind of thing, rather than but if we read Scripture and we recognize what Jesus did to allow us to be able to approach Him in that way, I think that's what gives us the peace or confidence, really.
Yeah.
The confidence.
That's what Hebrews would say.
That's right.
Yep.
And so the confidence to approach God in that way, and not in a timid, fearful of this deity who has he can snap his fingers and I can be dead kind of thing. But no, he's my Father who cares for me and has a plan for me and leads me in this life, and and so it kind of that confidence, I think, is very important there.
Yep.
In the Lord's Prayer, we have one particular passage, when talking about in verses 3 and 4, praying for provision.
Yep.
And I think this might be the question that you referenced a little bit earlier in the podcast.
It was.
And I think it's interesting, because a lot of times we look at this, and right or wrong, we have in traditional Christian culture, if a family prays, they're going to pray before a meal.
Yep.
If that's the only time they pray, they're going to pray before a meal.
Yep.
Especially in the South, that's what we do, kind of thing. And so the question is that kind of praying before a meal, is that kind of meeting this praying for God's provision piece?
I would. This is going to be interesting for me, because usually I take kind of like a both and approach. I'm going to take a hard line here and say no, it is not the same thing. One, so we mentioned in the podcast last week or the week before, I think it was last week, that there are lots of different types of prayers. And the prayer that we see Jesus suggest for us is give us each day our daily bread, is a prayer of supplication where we're asking God to supply our needs.
Right.
The prayer before a meal, more often than not, is characterized by thanksgiving, where we're acknowledging that God has supplied our needs.
Sure.
So I see it as one is an acknowledgement of the fact that God has fulfilled what we've asked of Him to supply that daily need. The other is I realize at the beginning of my day or at some point during my day I need God to supply this for me. Of myself, I can't trust that I'm going to get this, but with my Father, I know that I can go to Him and ask for daily bread, and I know that He's done it in other places. Like I've experienced that through the Exodus wanderings of His people.
Yeah.
They had bread every single morning when they got up,
Yeah.
and still, the expectation was they would trust that He would bring it to them the next day, and that they would ask for it, and He would give it, and so. No, I do not think those are the same things. It doesn't mean that it's bad to pray before a meal. I think it's good because I think it's good that we acknowledge the fact that God has supplied our needs. It's an act of humility on our part in both cases. One, to ask for it because I know that I can't get it by myself, and two, to acknowledge the fact that God has supplied that I, through my own strength and power, didn't get it. Both are good, but they're different.
Yeah, and I think if I'm not mistaken, kind of. A better kind of Greek understanding and translation of give us each day our daily, or give us, I can't remember exactly how that translation says it, but it's really better translated as, give us the bread for tomorrow.
Yep.
And it's always, I think that's interesting because you're always looking forward to tomorrow. I'm not praying and saying, God, take care of me today. I'm always looking ahead and saying, God, I recognize that I'm going to need you tomorrow, and I recognize I'm going to need you tomorrow. And, matter is tomorrow never gets here, but we always need, to pray and seek God for that provision day by day, and recognize I'm always looking ahead to tomorrow because I realize that, yes, today is going to be a prayer of thanksgiving because I have what I need, but I know I still need you tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so along those lines, next question is, how can I be reminded that I am in need of God daily? Because I think the biggest challenge that I see kind of in this context is, especially in American culture, it is a very, work hard, achieve, do what you have to provide for your family type culture. Mm-hmm. We work, we earn a paycheck. I use that paycheck to pay for bills, to put food on the table,
right.
And kind of go through this normal, sort of thing where if we have a job, then a lot of times we can fall in that trap of, well, I'm providing for my family. I'm doing this for my family. Yeah. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. And we're able to do all these things. We go on vacations together, all these types of things. And it's easy to get caught up in all those things that we are working hard to achieve. And we forget to put God in that place of priority, or maybe even say, well, I think that is where the temptation comes in with individuals who perhaps don't have a relationship with Jesus, is to say, well, why do I need Jesus? Yep. Because I've got this, I've got food, I've got a nice house, I've got all these things. We live in a very affluent area, and so I know that's a culture that we live in here, and so we can become very, I was talking to one of our staff members this morning, and the term apathetic came up, and we can become very apathetic to God or the need of God because in our culture, we have resources. Mm-hmm. So I say all that to kind of say, what can I do to be reminded that I may have these physical resources, but what can I do on a daily basis to be reminded that I need God daily? And you mentioned in the sermon the idea of the spiritual healing that we, of course, can't do on our own.
Right.
But is there any other ways that we can really identify and hone in on that?
Yeah, I think there are. Obviously, just starting with that acknowledgement. I think starting with the acknowledgement of our spiritual state helps us understand our identity. Like a big part of this, I was just talking with Stacy Albritton about the concept of identity and how important it is to establish that. I talked about several weeks ago for us as human beings, we have to see ourselves as God sees us. We've talked about humility, right? And so, on one hand, we are people made in the image of God, with dignity and value and purpose by our very being, because we've been made in that way, but also sinners, who have strayed from God, who are in rebellion to God, and who need to be brought back into the family of God through the work of Jesus Christ. These things are both true at the same time.
Yeah.
And so what that means is because I'm a sinner, I'm always going to be in need.
Right.
And I'm always, so like when we acknowledge that spiritual part, I think that's part of it. But with regard to the physical part of it, like I said, this is one of those places where tithing is really, really good for us as believers. Because it is a reminder that the financial things that I have, one, are not the be-all, end-all of my life. I can give those things away and be fine with that.
Yeah.
And it's because I know that God is the one who has given me these things. And so I'll never forget, Julie had a conversation with somebody that she was working with in North Carolina at the hospital there, and they had a conversation about tithing. I can't remember exactly the context of the conversation, but the lady that was talking with her was like, I don't understand why you give money to your church. And she said, well, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that God has provided for us and given us these things and given us the opportunities to get these things and those sorts of things. And she was like, but you worked hard to get all that yourself. And she said, yes and no. Yes, that's true. I did work hard, but God has given me the intellectual capability to think and to execute on the hard work that I've put in. He's given me the family that I have that allowed me to be able to go to school for basically free because they were able to pay for stuff. I mean, like, these things were provided by God. And so, like, it's a reminder that we can think to ourselves, well, we're here because of the things that we've done. But in all cases, every single case, no matter what has happened in our lives, we are where we are because of the work and effort of other people. And then we can just stretch that back all the way to, well, God is the one who has ultimately put us in this place.
Yeah.
He's put us in this time period. He's put us in this region of the world. He's he's put us in the jobs that we're in. He's provided all of these things as opportunities for us. And so it's important to just kind of work back, I think, as far as that acknowledgement goes of that daily need of God, and giving is a way that you can do that.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, kind of goes to the idea of, it's easier to get a camel to the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. And I think where that comes into play is this idea of self-reliance, and rather than recognizing what God has done for us. And when we find ourselves in places of perhaps prosperity or financial stability or whatever it might be, we give ourselves a lot of credit in that. But like you said, where that reminder has to come into play is that the reason I'm here, and this is because of a particular skill set, particular intellect, whatever it is, all those are things that we can't control on our own. These are inward things that God has created us and given us, abilities and all those types of things. And I think that's where it comes into play is, you might be in a position where you are very, affluent and have a lot of resources and whatever it might be, but, that doesn't mean that you're doing this all on your own. God has a piece of that, because then the question I always like to ask, well, what would happen if, you're in an accident, a car accident, and you lose, your ability, maybe you're a contractor and you do very well building houses and things like that. And what happens if you're in an accident and you're paralyzed, and all of a sudden this ability to get in and do those things is diminished? Or what happens if you are, whatever, if you're in an accident and have some type of brain damage, or, all sorts of things could happen, because we live in a fallen world.
Yep.
And if our security is in those skills and abilities that we found, then we're going to be in a place of despair, in a place of turmoil, because we're going to be stripped away of all that. Yep. And so we've got to get to a place to where we recognize that God is going to provide for us, whether it be through those skills and abilities, or if those skills or abilities were stripped away, God's still going to provide for us, and we've got to be able to trust and lean in on that. Yep. The last kind of piece is the idea of temptation, and we as a staff kind of talked through that a little bit last week in staff meeting, and looking at trying to figure out the best understanding of that, what that means, to God kind of lead us through temptation. And it's not, as we kind of talked through, it's not that God is leading us to be tempted or anything like that. But I think,
James makes that really clear that that's not the case.
That's right.
That God's not going to tempt us to sin.
That's right. And I think in the sermon, you said it very well, and kind of this idea that, we need God's lead in temptation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, critical, because, a lot of times we find ourselves in those moments of being tempted of whatever sin, just insert sin here kind of deal. We a lot of those times we miss, God in that, and we miss the opportunity to follow God in that. And as I kind of think through earlier when we were talking about approaching God as Father, if we are approaching Him as just some deity, or this distant God who is just ready to smite us whenever the opportunity arises, in those moments of sin, that's the last place we're going to look is to God our Father, because I'm going to try to hide in shame or run from God or whatever it might be. But in actuality, based on this passage, we see that God is there with us to lead us through that temptation. And so the question is, how does God do that? What does that actually look like for Him to lead us through that temptation?
Yeah, Paul comments on this, and very practically kind of gives us a guide for what this looks like. So if you would look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 speaks directly to this. So I want to go back to verse 11, and I'm going to work there because basically he's in the middle of talking about like Israel's history and how they struggled with idolatry at times, and like they struggled with grumbling and complaining against the Lord and those sorts of things. And then he gets into verse 11. He says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." So you think about Israel, things were like they saw all these miracles, these incredible things that God did. And the very next chapter, after they sing this wonderful song of victory, they're grumbling.
Yeah.
They're like, "Moses, you brought us out here to die. Come on. Like, what's going on?" And Paul's like, lest you think to yourself, okay, Jesus saved me, and the very next day you wake up and you're like, all right, Jesus, I don't understand why I'm still going through this, or these things are still happening to me, or why am I still struggling with this particular, sinful mindset or whatever.
Yeah.
And you start to grumble. Okay. He says, look, listen, be careful, because you're about to fall if you're not careful. But he says this in verse 13, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man." So everything that we experience as temptation and to sin or to struggle or whatever is common to somebody else.
Right.
So that's an important part of all of this with regard to temptation, how God helps us and those sorts of things, is He puts people around us that have experienced similar things and that we can rely on and ask for help.
Sure.
That's why the church exists. We are meant to live in community.
Yeah.
Okay. He goes on from there, though. "God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." And so I can look at any situation where I find myself being led into temptation by myself. God's not going to lead me into temptation, but He can lead me out of it.
Yeah.
And He's going to provide a way of escape in every situation. It's my job to take that way of escape.
Yeah.
I think about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It would have been easy for him to give in that situation and, enter into an adulterous relationship.
Right.
And instead, he regularly took that way of escape. Now, you may look at that situation and you say, well, it didn't work out very well for him. Actually, it did in the large scheme of things, because Joseph's life wasn't just about him. It was about preserving a whole bunch of people's lives, which he got. But there was always that way of escape for him.
Yeah.
And so I think that God functions the same way. And the foundational phrase in there in that whole verse is God is faithful.
Yes.
So we can know that anytime we are wandering in toward temptation, God is faithful to provide us a way out of it.
Yeah.
And that's what God's leading looks like. I think it's twofold. One, He's going to put people around us that have experienced similar things so that we can never believe the lie that we're alone in this.
Yeah.
We're alone in this sin or this struggle. And that's, by the way, that's what the enemy wants you to believe, because I mentioned a few weeks ago, he's that roaring lion. When he roars, the sheep scatter.
Yeah.
And when he gets one sheep by itself, then he can devour it easily. So if we withdraw from people because we're in sin or because we're struggling, that's when we're vulnerable, incredibly vulnerable. So what you're experiencing in sin is not something that nobody else has ever experienced. It's something that somebody else around you has experienced.
Yeah.
This is where vulnerability and transparency is vital to community. This is where we have to tell the truth about our lives and our stories so that people around us can say, okay, I've experienced that too.
Right.
And how did you get through that?
Yeah.
And then that getting through part is where God has provided the way of escape.
Yeah.
So I think that's a twofold answer to that question.
That's really good. And I think that as we kind of process and walk through this prayer, I think it all comes back to, again, how we relate to the Father. Because as we kind of talk through prayer and we're looking at this as an opportunity to interact with Him, Jesus modeled that. In the first week this series, you went through all the places where it shows Jesus prayed. He modeled that for the disciples, time and time again, and placed emphasis on this relationship that He had with the Father. And if we have a relationship with the Father where we recognize that He's there for us, that He's going to lead us through whatever temptation we find ourselves in, He's there going to provide for us, and that motivation now in prayer becomes recognizing I'm going to place all of my dependence on Him, and that's what prayer is, I think. And so as you listen to the podcast or watch and you continue to process this idea and what it looks like to pray, and I encourage you in all of this is to recognize that all prayer is a submission to God and His authority, and recognize that He is in control. And I think as we process and we talk through the different types of prayer like we did last week, whether it be a prayer of thanksgiving or supplication or repentance, all of those things is having a authentic relationship with the Father and communicating with Him in those various areas and recognizing His dominion over our life. And so as you think through that and as you process that over this next week, I encourage you to take time to pray this week, very specifically, maybe mark it down certain times of the day to pray for specific things, or do a prayer journal, or, repent, whatever it might be. Just take some time this week to just open up your heart to submission to the Father and approach Him just as that, as a Father who cares for you deeply and is there to lead and guide every aspect of your life. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Michael or any other staff member for that matter. We'd be happy to talk about any of this further, or any other content, maybe something in the sermon you heard or something you heard on the podcast, whatever it might be. Don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. But as always, I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.